Alireza Firouzja is one of the most spectacular chess players in the world today, and in this video, I'm going to show you how he plays the London system as white against some of the world's strongest chess grandmasters, including Gukesh D, Fabiano Caruana, and Magnus Carlsen himself, the greatest chess player of all time. Now, of course, the London system typically occurs after the moves 1d4, then knight f6 from black, and finally bishop to f4. Now, this is the key London system move, developing the dark squared bishop outside the pawn chain onto this diagonal, and from there, white intends to continue with moves like knight to f3, e3, bishop e2, short castles, and finally the move c3, bolstering the center, reaching a position that looks just like this one on your screen right now. Of course, black has many different ways to play against the London system from white, so with that in mind, I'm going to show you 5 completely different games where Alireza Firouzja fights against all of black's most important and strongest setups. And make sure you watch all the way until the end of this video, because in game number 5, Alireza plays against Magnus Carlsen. It's a fascinating back and forth game, and in that game, Magnus plays a totally unique idea to challenge Alireza Firouzja's London system. You definitely do not want to miss that game. Alright, in the game, Alireza Firouzja opens up with the London system with the move 1d4, and then of course the move bishop to f4, the key London system move. Now black has a wide variety of options. The most popular lies do involve playing d5, immediately challenging white's pawn, and then c5, breaking on the queen side. Of course, there are some other ideas, and we're going to see those later in this video, but in the game here, Gukesh does go for the absolute main line, d5, then after e3 from white, it plays the move c5, breaking on the queen side. Now from here, white continues knight to f3. This is very, very standard. White typically follows up e3 and knight to f3 in some order. It doesn't really matter too much which one you play first here as white. And now black has a very, very big decision. The most important thing is, do you want to play for an early e6, or do you want to try to get that bishop outside the pawn chain, perhaps to f5, or to g4 before playing that e6 move as black? Now, both of these moves have their own pros and cons. We're going to cover both of them throughout this video, but in this specific game, Gukesh goes to the line with the move e6. Now, this does allow for more rapid kingside development, but it does block in that bishop on the c8 square, so again, it's a very double-edged idea from black. Now, from here, white continues knight to d2. This is the main move for white in this position, and now here, Gukesh goes for a very popular and trending line at the highest level. That is simply queen to b6, and what this move does is it immediately targets that weak pawn on the b2 square. Of course, that pawn was weakened on move 2 with the move bishop to f4, that bishop no longer defending the pawn. So black's idea here is very simple. First, he challenges the pawn on the b2 square. Then if white defends with, say, rook b1, b3, queen to c1, something like that, then black's going to follow up with the move bishop d6 typically. And with this move, black is going to challenge that London bishop on the f4 square and try to castle with a good game. Now from here, Alireza only really has one challenging move. That is rook to b1. That is what he plays in the game. Now the rook does defend the pawn on the b2 square, and black has to figure out how he's going to proceed. Well, really there are a couple of main options. One is bishop d6. This is the one I was more familiar with prior to this game. And now here Gukesh plays a very creative idea. He first takes on d4. White obviously takes back with the e-pawn. He's trying to keep that pawn on the d4 square, controlling the center. And then here he plays the strongest move into position. And when I first saw this game was played at the 2024 Candace tournament from this year. When I first saw this move, I had never seen it before, bishop to d7. Now, what's the idea behind this move? Black actually wants to go bishop to b5, try to knock off white's light square bishop. And of course, if he does that, black already has the pawns on the light squares. He's basically trying to get rid of his problem bishop. Then if that happens, black's only going to have his good bishop, aka his dark squared bishop left. That's going to be fantastic, and that's what happens in the game. c3, and then bishop b5 from Gukesh. Again, threatening the trade on the f1 square. What a creative idea from Gukesh. Now from here, what is Alireza supposed to do? Well, if he takes that bishop on the b5 square, black simply takes back with the queen, and then white cannot castle as this queen controls the f1 square. White would castle into check. So this is kind of a big problem for Alireza. I mean, here bishop takes b5 is not the move. But with that in mind, if he can castle, what the heck is he supposed to do to continue increasing the pressure on black's position? Well, the truth is there is one very strong idea for white here, and Alireza finds it. That is the move h4. Now, if you're a beginner, this move may look a little bit puzzling. I mean, what the heck is white trying to accomplish with this pawn move? Well, it's very simple. He wants to go h5, maybe even h6, just gaining space on the king side. And from there, he has ideas of lifting the rook to the third rank with the move rook to h3, then maybe rook to g3 next, and from the g3 square, that rook is going to pressure the king side. So let's see how Gukesh responds. In the game, he starts knight to d7. Again, he doesn't want to capture on the f1 square. Then white simply recaptures with the king, and then white's king is going to get tucked away on the g1 square, being perfectly safe. So with that in mind, he develops the knight to the d7 square, and it's a little bit better placed on d7 as opposed to c6, as from here it's just a little bit closer to the defense of the king side in case he needs it later in the game. Now here, Alireza continues his plan. He goes rook to h3, setting up rook to g3 threats, a very powerful idea. Now, I do want to mention the computer does like the idea of h5 a little bit better here. The idea is after h5, black no longer has the response h5 trying to block the king side. So, for example, here after rook to h3, black technically has the idea of h5. This is very strong, preventing h5 ideas from white. Now, fortunately for us, Gukesh did not find this idea in the game. Instead of h5, he goes bishop to e7, simply setting up short castling on the king side. And that one mistake was all that Alireza needed. Here, h5 is the move. Again, he's threatening h6 on the next move if Gukesh gives him the opportunity. So, for example, if Gukesh were to castle here, then h6, forcing out g6 from black, and this pawn wedge on the h6 square is going to be a permanent thorn in black's side. I mean, you can just imagine if white ever somehow gets a queen threatening onto the g7 square, that would be deadly. However, instead of allowing that, here Gukesh does sense danger. He does go h6, stopping the idea of h6 from white. However, this move has its own weaknesses. Just imagine a scenario where white goes rook to g3, and then black has the king castled king side. Here, white could even play bishop takes h6 as that g-pawn is now pinned to the king by the rook. Now, of course, these three moves didn't happen in the game. White didn't even go rook to g3. But however, we can see this h-pawn, all the h6 square is now a permanent weakness in the black position, and this bishop is eyeing up it very, very nicely. Now here in this position, Alireza shows the flexibility of the London system. In the London, you can play pretty much on any part of the board, the center, the king side, or even the queen side. Here, Alireza expands with the move a4 on the queen side, threatening the bishop. And in a lot of lines, he may even want to expand a5, just gaining more and more space and restricting black's pieces. So overall, this is a very cool idea by Alireza. Now here, Gukesh finds the best move, simply bishop takes f1. It's not a move he normally wants to play. However, the bishop is being attacked by the move a4, and there is simply nothing better. For example, if black goes bishop to a6, then white even has the pawn sacrifice a5, trying to deflect the queen. Now, the idea behind this is if black does take the pawn, then white can go b4, and after the queen moves, he has the idea of b5, actually trapping the bishop on the a6 square. So all this to say, bishop to a6 in this position here is simply not a good idea. Instead, Gukesh simply has to capture that bishop on the f1 square, which was the whole idea of bishop d7, then bishop b5 in the first place. So, bishop takes f1 on the board. Now, of course, Alireza takes with the king. His idea is he wants to bring the king to the g1 square, and from there, the king is sort of artificially castled, and it looks pretty safe. So, that's what happens in the game. Castles kingside for black, and then king to g1 for white. Now from here, Alireza's plan is very, very simple. He's going to leverage this bishop and the rook to put pressure on white's king side, and he's also going to try to gain more and more space on the queen side, just kind of clamping down all over the board. Now here for black, the most logical moves look like a5, try to gain more space on the queen side, or perhaps rook to c8, getting the rook onto the open c-file. However, instead of those, here Gukesh plays the queen move, queen to c6. And I'm going to be honest, I don't fully understand the idea behind this move. I guess you're getting out of the way of the b-pawn if you want to advance it at some point. But here, even ideas like knight to e5 are now hitting the queen. That looks a little bit more dangerous to me for black. And that's what happens in the game. Here, Alireza just jumps in with the knight to the e5 square. And of course, this move is significantly more dangerous now that it does target the queen, whereas before, that wasn't the case. Now here, black, of course, has to deal with the threat. And the best way to do that is simply taking on e5 with the knight. Real fast if black doesn't do that. Let's say he just moves the queen back back where it came from, back to the b6 square. Then white is going to dominate the entire board. For example, he could go rook to g3, threatening bishop takes h6. Then king to h8 is forced, and then white could switch back to the queen side, gaining even more space with the move b4. And here, white is literally dominating the center, the king side, the queen side, absolutely everything. And I would not want to be black in this position. So going back to here, of course, black is going to take on e5 with the knight. Knight takes e5 is the move. Then d takes e5 from white, and finally knight to d7, retreating the knight, simply putting more pressure on the e5 pawn. Now here, Alireza finds a good move, rook to g3, of course threatening bishop takes h6. Now king to h8 from black, and now Alireza expands further on the queen side as we discussed, but this time it's the move a5. Now, this move a5 is definitely the right idea in this position. However, it may not have been the most precise execution of the idea. For example, instead of e5, perhaps rook to a1 first. That way, when you go a5 in the future, that pawn is already defended. And here's why that matters. After the move a5, here Gukesh finds the absolutely brilliant move, queen to c7. Now, this move looks simple, but it's very, very strong. Black's idea is after the queen goes to the c7 square, it is now targeting the pawn on a5 and the pawn on e5 with the knight and the queen. And that means one of these pawns is going to fall. And now Alireza has to decide which pawn do you want to sacrifice. Well, as they say, the pawns in the middle of the board are the most important. With that in mind, here Alireza goes knight to f3, keeping the e5 pawn, but giving up that pawn on the a5 square. And that's what happens. Queen takes a5. So once again, a few moves prior, if Alireza went rook to a1 before going a5, that pawn would have been defended preemptively, which stops the whole queen takes a5 or queen to e5 forking idea from black. Now here, Alireza is of course down an entire pawn. He no longer has his a pawn. However, the position here is still pretty level overall. So where is white's compensation coming from? Well, if you just look at his pieces overall, white has a lot more activity. He's also able to expand on the queen side still with ideas like b4 and c4. And as overall, he's still just kind of strategically dominating the game. Now, in this position, Alireza does have a forced draw at his disposal if he wants it. The way he gets it is by simply sacrificing the bishop on the h6 square. Bishop takes h6, and now black has nothing better than g takes, but then queen d2 targets the pawn on the h6 square. The only way to stop checkmate, and yes, that would literally be checkmate, is the move king to h7, but then white can go queen d3 check, forcing the king back, and then after queen d2, king h7, we have a draw by repetition. So point being, on move 20, bishop takes h6 was a viable idea if Alireza wanted a draw, but he does not want to draw in this game. Instead, he is playing on, and to do that, he goes for the win with the move c4, expanding on the queen side. Good stuff. Now here, Gukesh goes rook to g8, just improving the placement of the rook and preemptively defending the g7 square. Solid idea. And now here, it's actually quite difficult to find the right follow-up for Alireza. In the game, he goes rook to a1. This turns out to be a little bit of a mistake. However, the best alternative may have only given him an endgame a pawn down. For example, c takes d5 may be the best move for white, but then after queen takes, e takes, yes, in the endgame, white's pieces are definitely more active than black's. And yes, black does have 3 pawn islands versus white's 2, which does mean white's pawn structure is a little bit safer. However, overall, this is definitely not that great of an endgame for white as he is down a pawn still. So instead, rook to a1 on the board, a little bit of a mistake. And here Gukesh jumps in with the queen to the b4 square. Very good, stopping b4 ideas from white and also targeting the b2 pawn, as well as that pawn on the b4 square. Now here, Alireza defends with the move b3, solid, but then knight to c5 from Gukesh, just starting to really activate his pieces, and we can really see that he's starting to take over in this game. Of course, from here, knight to e4 is a threat that would target the rook on the g3 square, and e4 is just a tremendous square for the knight in general. And that is what happens. Knight d4 from white, knight e4 from black, of course targeting the rook. The rook has to move. In the game, Alireza goes rook to e3, not a bad idea, but then queen c5 does put pressure on that knight on the d4 square. Now from here, both sides start to centralize their pieces. White goes rook c1, lining up the rook with the queen, always a good idea, and black goes rook d8, setting up d takes c4 threats. If black manages to get that move in on the next move, then that knight on the d4 square would hang, as both the queen and the rook would be targeting it. So this right here is an absolutely critical position for Alireza. He has to find something right now to keep the game going. And in the game, he finds an absolutely brilliant idea. And if you like puzzles, this is a great time to pause the video and try to figure out the right move for Alireza right here. Well, I hope you found it. The key move for white is actually the pawn sacrifice b4. Okay, what is the idea behind this move b4? Well, it's very simple. First of all, black retreats the queen, then the queen's putting less pressure on white's center. Now white can take on d5, and after e takes, there's actually the idea of e6. And from here, white's threatening bishop to c7, forking both the rook and the queen. So overall, very dangerous idea. Of course, the best move for black is simply taking the pawn. That is the critical test of this pawn sacrifice, and that is what Gukesh does in the game. However, this gives white the opportunity to take on the d5 square, and here black has to find a very good resource immediately. I mean, if black simply takes the pawn on d5 with his pawn, then white has the resource rook to b3. And just look at these rooks on the queen side. They are incredibly active. Of course, the queen has to move, then white's going to have a ton of threats after that. So instead of e takes d5, black has to find a killer move right now, and he finds it. Once again, another good time for a puzzle. If you like puzzles, pause the video right now and solve this one. The move for Gukesh is knight takes f2. You actually sacrifice the knight. Here's why. After white takes the knight back with the king, then black jumps in with the rook. Rook takes d5 is the move, and now this knight on the d4 square, it's pinned twice. The rook pins it to the queen pins it to the bishop because the bishop's actually hanging in this position. So now if we count pieces, here black is down a minor piece. White has the knight and the bishop versus the bishop of black. However, black does have 3 extra pawns in this position and a lot of activity. So overall, it's anyone's guess who's going to come out on top in this game. Now from here, white has 2 main options to defend, rook d3 or rook to e4. In the game, he goes rook to e4. Black goes rook a to d8, doubling up the rooks, putting more pressure on that knight. And white retreats the bishop, bishop b3, but black increases the pressure one more time, bishop to c5, and obviously here, this rook on c1 is unable to defend the knight. So at this point, something's gotta give right here. Well, Alireza has one good move here. He finds it. That is queen to b3, offering the queen trade. Now Gukesh has nothing better than taking the queen with his own queen. The queens come off the board. Black takes on e3, white takes back, and now we have an endgame where white once again has the extra piece versus the 3 pawns of black. Black's plan is obvious. He's got to get those pawns rolling down the board as quickly as humanly possible. Meanwhile, white has to defend and try to make use of his extra minor piece. All right, from here, black is started with a5. White responds rook to c7, activating the rook, pressuring both b7 and f7. And here, instead of defending, black simply goes for a4, the best move by far. Now, knight c5 from white, rook to a8 from black, supporting the pawn. But here, knight d7 from white, and all of a sudden, white has some dangerous threats against the black king. Now here, the best idea for black, believe it or not, is simply the move a3, again, continuing to push the pawns down the board and ignoring white's threats. Instead, he goes for the move king to h7. Now, this turns out to be an absolutely critical mistake. It's simply too slow. Here, white goes rook to f3, pressuring f7, and you're about to see why it's so dangerous. Here, black goes a3, but white rook takes f7, and now the threat is knight to f6. That pawn will be pinned to the king. That is one of those problems with the move king to h7. And what is black supposed to do here? If he goes a2, then the idea is knight f6, king to h8, then rook, threatening rook to h7, checkmate, because the knight defends the square on g8. So instead of that, instead of a2, here black goes king to h8, but then knight to f8 from white is the move. Black goes a2, then knight to g6. Now in this position, black is forced to go king to h7, but that would result in checkmate after the move rook takes g7. And for that reason here, Gukesh resigns on the spot to Alireza Firouzja and his London opening. And just to show you the finisher real fast, the move is king to h7, then rook takes g7, and that is checkmate. The king has nowhere to go. All right, diving into game number 2, we have Alireza Firouzja versus the number 2 rated player in the world at the time, Fabiano Caruana, and this game took place in the 2024 Superbet Chess Classic. Now, as usual here, Alireza opens with d4 and then knight to f6, the typical London system move. And in the last game, we saw Gukesh go for the very strong and popular line with d5, c5, and an early queen to b6. Now, in this game, Fabiano Caruana goes for a completely different idea. His goal is to shock his opponent. He goes for the move b6. Now, the idea behind this move is very simple. He wants to go bishop to b7, exerting pressure on the long diagonal in the spirit of the Queen's Indian defense. However, the drawback of this move is it does not put any pressure on white's center. And for that reason here, Alireza immediately expands on the queen side with the move c4. This is definitely the best idea. Now black, bishop b7, obviously the logical move, controlling e4 with the bishop and the knight. Now white, knight to c3. Now it's important to note here, after knight to c3, e4 is not a threat. White only has one piece supporting it, whereas black still has those two minor pieces controlling that square. Now from here, the move I expected when I first saw this game was, of course, e6. Here black has some sort of a Queen's Indian style structure in the center and on the queen side. However, instead of e6, here Fabiano Caruana, he shocked me. He went for the move d6. The idea is he wants to transpose some sort of weird King's Indian style position. I mean, he might go knight d7, g6, bishop g7, and even e5 in the near future. So this will be very interesting. Here, Alireza Firouzja goes knight to f3, then g6 from black. And as we expected, black getting both of those bishops on these long diagonals here. Now, how is white supposed to respond? Well, typically in these King's Indian structures, you just go e4. Typically, there's not a bishop on b7 controlling that. Now, if white wanted to force through a very fast e4, then the move queen to c2 was possible. And of course, from there, if black goes bishop g7, then simply e4 is a good idea. However, instead, Alireza Firouzja immediately blocks the center with the move d5. Now, this does indirectly cover the e4 square. Now, white's only defending it once, but black's only attacking it once as well, and that means e4 next is very possible. So from here, bishop g7 from black. Of course, e5 was a move here, trying to knock the bishop immediately, but it's not super dangerous yet. Instead, bishop g7, e4, castles, and then bishop d3 from Alireza. Now from here, black goes e5, knocking that bishop off the f4 square, and now our London bishop has a big choice. Where do you want to go? The most logical ideas are g5, e3, and d2. Now in the game, Alireza actually goes bishop to d2. This move looks a little bit passive to me. I mean, e3 was still very playable. If black goes knight to g4, trying to knock the bishop off the e3 square, I think this is what Alireza was worried about. But then you can simply go bishop g5, and that bishop is defended by the knight, and black has a very uncomfortable choice. Do you retreat the knight? Do you play the Ben Feingold signature move, f6? I mean, neither of those moves look particularly good for black, so I would have liked to see bishop e3 here, but instead, bishop d2, not a bad move either. Now here, black expands on the queen side with the move a5. Of course, the idea of this in the King's Indian is to stop an early b4 advance from white. Now a3, knight to a6, again with the knight eyeing the c5 square. From there, it puts a lot of pressure on e4, solid idea. White goes bishop c2, simply retreating the bishop preemptively, getting out of the way of those knight to c5 ideas. From there, it would put pressure on the bishop. So bishop c2, a good prophylactic idea. And now here, Fabiano Caruana has a very big decision to make. So far, he's largely developed the queenside pieces, and for that reason, it may be a good idea to continue doing something on the queen side before trying to get play going on the king side with that standard King's Indian style move f5. Now, Fabiano agrees, and he goes for the move c5, trying to lock down the queen side. However, this move looks a little bit curious to me. I mean, now that bishop on the b7 square is really blocked out of the game, what the heck is it doing on b7? Now, instead of this, the computer does like the idea of going c6. The idea is if white takes, then black can take back with the bishop and is quite active. And if white doesn't take, let's say bishop to e3, then black can take on d5, then simply go bishop to c8. And from there, the plan would be bishop d7, rook c8, trying to control the queen side. And from there, maybe getting some kingside play going with knight to h5 or knight to e8, and finally the key move f5. So overall, c6 was the better move according to the engine, but instead c5 on the board from Fabiano Caruana, a logical idea, just maybe not quite as strong. Now here in this position, white goes bishop g5, pinning the knight to the queen, very good idea here. And black simply responds h6, knocking the bishop back, bishop e3, Now if black wanted to, he could go knight g4, forcing the bishop back to the d2 square where it started. So for example, knight g4, bishop d2, but then sooner or later, white's going to go h3, knocking the knight back, and then white can return bishop e3, so this wouldn't really do a whole lot for black, surprisingly. Now, instead of that, here black goes knight to c7. The idea being that c5 square is now occupied by the pawn, therefore knight c5 never going to happen. So he's trying to reroute the knight to a better square. Now here, of course, the queenside has been completely blocked by black. What the heck should white be doing here? Well, it is possible to try and blow open the queenside with the move b4. For example, you could go rook b1, then b4. However, there's another idea of actually playing on the king side, and the way to do that is with the Makhachkov style move h3, and that is what Alireza Firouzja does in the game. The idea, of course, is to follow up with the move g4 in the spirit of the Makhachkov variation against the King's Indian. Now from here, Fabi goes bishop c8, excellent move. The bishop obviously not doing anything on the b7 square, c8 a much better square overall. Now white, queen d2, threatening the pawn on h6. Black responds king h7, simply defending the pawn. And now finally, Alireza expands on the king side with the move g4, and now we get a very interesting game. Of course, after this move, white is almost never going to castle on the king side. So with that in mind, the king's going to be stuck in the middle of the board or perhaps on the queen side. So with that in mind, Fabiano Caruana, he decides to get some counterplay going on the queen side immediately with the move rook to b8. The threat, of course, is b5 at some point. And from there, white's king is not going to be safe on the queen side if he ever long castles. Now from here, white's best plan is going to be continuing to attack on the king side, and he does that with the move g5. Now after h takes, bishop takes, once again, that knight is pinned on the f6 square to the king, and white has the very obvious follow-up idea, h4, then h5, again trying to open up more files against the black king. Of course, Fabiano Caruana sees this, and he immediately goes for the counterplay on the queen side with the move b5. Now h4 from white. Things are getting very, very tense. And here Fabiano decides it is time to attack the knight on the f3 square with the move bishop to g4. Very strong idea. Now, surprisingly, it's actually not very easy to find a good way to defend that knight on f3. In the game, Alireza Firouzja goes for the move bishop d1, defending with the bishop. However, now the bishop's actually quite passive. Instead of this, the best idea may have been knight to h2, getting the knight out of the attack of the bishop and returning the favor with the attack on the bishop on g4. From here, bishop h5 and rook g1 is likely best play. And again, white still has very good attacking chances with the idea of blowing open the king side with the move f4 at some point. Now, instead of this knight move, of course, here white goes bishop d1, simply defending the knight with the bishop. But here, black has a very strong idea. Queen d7, just continuing to put more pressure on the king side. Now here, Alireza senses danger. He actually plays a very strong pawn sacrifice. He goes h5, giving up the pawn to the knight. And his idea here is he wants to free the h4 square for his own knight. Knight to h4 on the board. Now, this may look kind of strange. I mean, after all, the knight isn't really doing a whole lot on the h4 square yet. And g6 and f5 are both currently being blocked off. But Alireza does have a plan here. Now, Fabi, bishop takes d1, white takes back with the queen, and then rook to h8, getting the rook on the newly opened h-file. Black's plan is king g8. His king will be very safe on g8. But here, white has a plan. If you like puzzles, again, this is a very good time to pause the video and to try to solve this one right here. The next move by white is absolutely brilliant. All right, I hope you found it. The move here for white is knight to f5. Yes, you give up the knight on f5, but that means the knight on the h5 square is going to be hanging in return. So absolutely brilliant idea, and that is what happens. G takes f5, and then queen takes h5 from white. Now, real fast, it's important to note, if black does not take the knight on the f5 square, he's going to be in trouble. For example, if black wastes a move, rook to b7, then white has a few different ideas. One idea is knight to e7. That one's more complicated. The simpler idea to understand is rook takes h5. Then after g takes, queen takes, suddenly the king side's being blown open and is to white's benefit here. So overall, again, knight to f5, very, very dangerous idea from white. And then black takes on f5, white takes back with the queen, king to g8, and finally queen to f3 from Alireza, the best retreat square for the queen. Of course, the only one that does defend the rook on the h1 square. Now from here, Fabi takes on h1, white takes back with the queen, and then finally f6, trying to block the king side and block the bishop out of the game. Now here, white retreats, bishop d2, and things have pretty much stabilized now. So let's do inventory. Overall, the only real difference in material is black has one extra pawn on the king side. However, it's not super important in this position, and overall, white's only a little bit worse. Now from here, black expands on the queen side, b4, white takes on b4, black takes back, and then knight to e2, simply returning the knight. Now overall, instead of knight to e2, knight d1 may have been a little bit stronger of a move, the idea being you want to reroute the knight to the e3 square. However, instead, after knight to e2, it's not really clear where the knight's going next. And if you're wondering about the g3 square, isn't g3 a good square for the knight? Well, black is going to permanently take that option off the table with the very strong move f4. Now, of course, the pawn does control g3, and now that knight on the e2 square is starting to look kind of silly. Well, white realizes that. He reroutes the knight to the g1 square, intending knight to f3, but now, boom, queen to g4. Again, infiltrating with the queen, just getting more and more active. Now here, white technically can play the move knight to f3, but it's a big mistake. Here, the idea from black is f5, making use of that extra pawn. And now if white takes on f5, which is a sort of forced, then black does not have to go queen takes f5. Instead, he has the intermediate move, e4. Boom, hitting both the knight and that pawn on the b2 square. If b2 falls, black's going to have a protected passed pawn on the b4 square. And overall here, white's position is just collapsing. So many of his pieces are on the back rank. So going back, knight to f3, obviously not good. And for that reason, knight to g1 really isn't that good of an idea either. Now here, white goes king to f1, trying to give more support to the knight with the king. But Fabiano is ready for it, and here he simply goes rook to a8, trying to force off the rooks off the board, and that is what happens. Rook takes, knight takes, and here white, once again, in trouble with most of his pieces on the back rank. Now here, the best move is potentially f3, trying to keep the queens off the board and trying to kick black's queen back. However, instead, queen to f3 was played by Alireza Firouzja, and while it does make sense to try and get queens off the board, in this specific position, it doesn't really work out in his favor, and here's why. In the game, black goes f5, the best move. You definitely don't take on f3. Then after knight takes f3, white is getting what he wants. So instead, f5 on the board, and now we have queen takes g4 and f takes g4, and now finally black got rid of his double pawn, is now a pawn on the g file, which definitely helps his chances. Now from here, f3 from white, hoping for g takes f3, then knight takes f3, but instead knight to b6 from black, targeting the pawn on the c4 square, then c3, and then knight to d7, intending knight to f6. Now, of course, if white takes on the g4 square, black reroutes the knight to f6, targeting that g4 pawn, and he's going to be perfectly fine. So instead, bishop e1 is the move from white, bishop to e1, and now g takes f3, knight takes f3, and finally knight to f6. All right, this is a good time to stop and talk strategy here. Obviously, black's immediate threat is knight to e4. White is going to have to defend with knight d2. And then from here, how is black going to make use of his extra pawn on the king side? Well, in the game, Fabiano Caruana demonstrates a brilliant strategy. He brings his knight way over to the d4 square. From there, it targets b3. So, of course, at that point, the knight on d2 will have to stay on d2 defending it. But then Fabi is going to put his bishop on this diagonal here and eventually go f3, at which point the bishop will be targeting the knight will have to move, and then black's knight on d4 will be able to clean up this pawn. So that's the strategy. Let's see how Fabiano does it in the game. Here, king to f7, king g2, knight g4, again, starting that rerouting process. Then from there, the knight jumps into the e3 square, then c2, and then finally, after a few more moves, a1. Sorry, I misspoke. a1 instead of the d4 square. Same idea, targeting that pawn on the b3 square. Now, of course, white has to go knight d2, defending the pawn, but then black slowly reroutes his bishop to this critical diagonal. We'll see both players kind of shuffling their pieces, black finally getting bishop g5 in, then black playing a few more waiting moves, just kind of shuffling until the time is right, and here the key move f3. Of course, the knight is now under attack. Knight takes f3 is forced, but that means sooner or later that b3 pawn is going to fall, and that's what happens right here. Now, in this position, if white does nothing, black is simply going to move his knight and then force through that pawn on the b1 square. So with that in mind, his best move, both from a practical standpoint and an objective one, is to sacrifice the bishop on the e5 square. The idea is you give up the bishop, but you get two central pass pawns in return, and you might have a chance. However, here Fabiano Caruana is just on top of his game. He brings in the bishop. The threat at some point is bishop d4. If white ever goes e5, the pawn will be under attack. And then after e5, knight d2, threatening the pawn on the c4 square. In this position, white resides, as there is simply no good way to stop black's threats of winning these pawns in the center and pushing his own pass pawn down the board. All right, diving into game number 3, we have a game between Alireza Firouzja and Jan Nepomniachtchi from the 2021 Carlsen Invitational Preliminaries. Now in the game, of course, Alireza opens with the London system with d4 and then bishop to f4. And in the last 2 games, we saw ideas like d5 followed by c5 and then b6 from Fabiano Caruana. But today, Jan Nepomniachtchi is going to go for a different line. That is the one with c5. Now, this is an extremely combative move. You don't see it a whole lot at the highest level, but it is actually very, very good for black. It's a great move. Here, the idea, obviously, is you're challenging that pawn, and if white simply defends it with a move like c3 or e3, black's going to go queen to b6, and this is the key idea. From that b6 square, the queen does pressure the b2 pawn, which is weak because the bishop already left the c1 square. Now, if you want to avoid this line as white entirely, then you do have an option of going here, knight to f3, and then if d5, only then bishop f4, the London system move. However, this move, bishop f4, is a little bit more flexible, and the only downside of it is black can go c5. But really, if you're prepared and if you watch this game right here, you won't have an issue with it. So in the game, Alireza Firouzja responds d5. That is by far the best move. And now here, black has a choice. There are the more solid ideas like d6 and g6. However, queen to b6 is the one tricky move you have to watch out for. Of course, this queen is targeting that pawn on the b2 square, and here white has to know how to respond. Now, if you get this in your own games, the safe move is bishop to c1. This move simply defends the pawn, and you are a little bit better here. Nothing to worry about. However, if you want the maximalist approach, the move that lets you fight for the biggest possible advantage in the opening as white, then instead of bishop c1, the move is knight to c3. You do sacrifice that pawn on the b2 square, but then you go bishop d2, defending the knight, and of course the rook is defended by the queen, and you're going to follow up moves like rook to b1, e4, f4, getting a huge pawn center, and you're going to have a lot of pressure on black's position. So for example, best move from black is simply queen b6, getting out of the way of rook b1, but then white can simply follow up with the moves f4 and then e4, getting a huge space advantage in the middle of the board. So overall, this move queen b6, nothing to worry about if you know what you're doing. Bishop c1 is the safe move. However, knight to c3 and then bishop d2 is the more principled and more aggressive idea from white. Now, in the game, instead of queen b6, Jan Nepomniachtchi did go for the move d6. This move is a little bit slower, and from here, white has pretty simple development. In the game, he goes knight to c3. Again, very good move. In these Benonite structures, when you have a pawn on d5, if you can go knight c3 instead of c4 first, then knight c3 is typically the best move, and that is also the case here. Now black, a6, threatening b5. White goes a4, stopping the b5 advance. Very standard stuff. And here black lashes out in the middle of the board, e5. This is the best move, gaining space, setting up bishop e7 and short castles, and black is trying to fight for a normal game. Now from here, white obviously goes bishop g5, the most active square for the bishop, also pinning the knight on the f6 square. Now Jan, bishop e7, and then knight f3 from Alireza. Now, of course, the move e4 here looks very logical, but this is a big mistake, believe it or not. Here, black has a tactical shot to win a pawn on the spot for pretty much nothing. Now, if you like puzzles, go ahead and pause the video right now and try to find the idea for black. This is a very important tactical idea in a lot of different openings, not just the London system. Now, of course, the key move for black here is going to be knight takes d5. The idea is if you recapture the knight with the pawn or the knight on c3, then black simply takes the bishop on g5 and he wins a pawn. For example, knight takes d5, then bishop takes g5. Now, the alternative doesn't work either. For example, if white simply takes the bishop on the e7 square, Then black recaptures with the knight, and once again, he is up a clean pawn in this position. So overall, this move e4, definitely not a good idea from white. Instead, knight to f3 is definitely the move, just continuing developing here. Now in this position, black has a big choice. The most natural move for black is going to be short castles, and from there again, e4 doesn't work. The same knight takes d5 idea applies. Therefore, bishop takes f6 is the best move. Then black recaptures, and finally white goes e4, claiming the center. And yes, he did give up the bishop pair. However, black's dark squared bishop here really isn't that beneficial for black. He may even try to trade it off at some point with the move bishop g5. So why am I saying all this? Well, in the game, Jan Nepomniachtchi did not go for the most logical move, castles. Instead, he went for a much more combative idea. That is the move e4. Now, what's the idea behind this? Well, if white retreats the knight, normally knight to g5 would be the idea, but of course that square is being occupied by the bishop. Therefore, d2 is the only good retreat square for the knight. But then black can simply jump in with the move knight to g4, threatening the bishop and threatening various e3 ideas, and things are already getting very, very chaotic. This just shows knight d2, not the best idea, but real fast while we're here, there's a really cool tactical idea I want to show you. If white takes the bishop, that's the best move. Black actually ignores the threat on the queen. Instead, he goes e3, threatening e takes f2 checkmate in one move. So, really cool line, but obviously not the one played in the game. Of course, Alireza is an expert with the London system. He does not waste tempo going knight d2, retreating, allowing knight g4. Instead, the key move for white here, of course, is bishop takes f6. Now, of course, the idea behind this move is you are trying to eliminate the defender of the pawn on the e4 square. If black simply takes back with the bishop or the pawn, then knight takes e4 is going to be the move. So, for example, bishop takes f6, knight takes e4. Of course, white is up a pawn, but that pawn on b2 is hanging. Now, best for black is taking the pawn on b2, rook b1 from white, bishop f6 from black, and now the position is stabilized. However, white does have that extra pawn in the middle of the board. His rook is very active on b1. He can always trade off his knight to the bishop on f6, and overall, white is a very dominant position here. So, going back to move 8, the move bishop takes f6 is not the right idea from black. You don't take the bishop on f6. Instead, you need to immediately go for the tactical strike, e takes f3. Now, what's the idea behind this? Well, it's very simple. Here, white obviously has to capture that bishop on the e7 square, but then instead of recapturing the bishop with the queen, the move here, believe it or not, is actually f takes g2, capturing the pawn on the g2 square. Now, here's the idea. If white takes the queen on d8, then black gets a new queen on the h1 square, and he wins the rook in the process. And here, black is actually up a rook in exchange for white's extra bishop, and black is essentially completely winning here. Now, of course, instead of bishop takes d8, the best move for white in this position is going to be recapturing the pawn on the g2 square with the bishop, and Alireza does find that. Bishop takes g2 on the board. Now black takes the bishop on e7, and finally the position has stabilized. Let's do inventory. Material is completely even. Both sides have the same number of pawns. Black missing the pawn on the e-file, white on the g-file. However, beyond that, white does have this very strong pawn center. The pawn on the d5 square acts as a wedge, and these pawns on e2 and f2 could advance, and that means white is overall better prospects in the middle game. Now, from here, the best move for Alireza is simply short castles, again setting up those f4 and e4 advances, just gaining space in the middle of the board. But instead, it goes for a very strange-looking idea, queen to d3. Now, you're going to have to wait until the next move to see the idea behind this move. I don't want to give it away. Here, black goes knight d7, and here Alireza shows his hand. He moves the queen over to the g3 square, trying to pressure g7, and also in some lines putting pressure on that pawn on the d6 square. Now, again, this is not the strongest idea. He had to waste 2 tempos just to do this. And here, black can simply short castle on the king side, and now the pawn is defended. And it would be one thing if he had a dark squared bishop still alive, where he could go bishop h6 trying to pressure the king side, but he really doesn't have any other pieces in proximity to the king. So overall, this idea of queen d3 and then queen g3 looks a little bit suspicious so far in this game, but let's see how he follows it up. Now from here, knight to e4, the idea behind this move is pressuring that pawn on the d6 square. But black simply goes knight to e5, guarding the pawn, And here is not really clear what white is doing. Now, because of white's strange idea of queen d3 then queen g3, black is already looking a little bit better, and white's got to come up with a good idea right now. One possible idea is actually rook to g1, the idea being the rook and the queen creating a battery on the g-file, and if this bishop ever moves to, say, f3 or h3, that would immediately create a checkmate threat on the g7 square, so not a bad attacking idea. Instead of that, here, Alireza goes for a different idea, starting with the move f4, the idea being, once again, trying to get those pawns rolling in the middle of the board. Here, black goes knight g4, of course, that knight being defended by the bishop on the c8 square, and then white h3, and finally, knight to h6 from black, a very good square for the knight. From there, it's eyeing the f5 square. Either the knight or the bishop could jump into that square in the very near future. Now, real fast, instead of knight to h6, knight to e3 was also possible, and here's why. If white takes the knight, that is the best move. Here, black just goes f5, and now the knight on the e4 square is pinned to the queen. If the knight moves anywhere, white loses the queen. That's obviously not a good idea. Therefore, black is going to win back that knight on the e4 square. Perhaps white castles, then f takes and queen takes. And once again, the position's roughly level. So overall, knight to e3, not the best idea from black. Instead, knight to h6, a much better idea in this position. Now from here, white castles, and here black has a big choice. Which miter piece do you want to put on the f5 square? In the game, black goes knight to f5. However, bishop f5 is also extremely playable. That knight on e4 is now being attacked twice, and black's going to have a lot of counterplay, especially with that bishop covering the very weak c2 square. But instead, knight to f5 played in the game, targeting the queen on the g3 square. Now, queen f2 from white and rook to e8 from black. This is a very solid move, getting the rook onto the open e-file where black's already exerting a lot of pressure. Of course, there were some other ideas. For example, bishop d7 was possible, or rook b8. Both of these moves setting up that b5 advance, getting space on the queen side. Now, from here, what is Alireza supposed to do? Well, he has a few different ideas. He could clamp down on the queen side with a5, or just try to defend in the center with the move e3. Instead of those, he goes for a very creative attacking idea. This move is not technically the strongest, but I like it the most in this position. That is the move rook to a3. So this is a very thematic idea in various positions in the London system. Of course, the rook being activated on the third rank. Now all sorts of rook moves over here are now possible in this game, depending on how the game progresses. So again, I just love this move. Black's going to have to be super, super careful now. Now in the game, knight d4 from black, that is the move. The idea is you are threatening the c2 square, winning the pawn, and hitting the rook on the a3 square. And believe it or not, here Alireza Firouzja, he does not defend the c2 pawn at all. Instead, he begs black to take it with the move e3. And this is actually the strongest idea in the position, and here's why. After knight takes c2, here, Alireza just goes rook to c3, once again putting pressure on the knight. And now from here, this pawn on the e3 square is perfectly defended by the rook. You never have to worry about queen takes e3 ideas. The knight can go somewhere else if needed. And here, white gets a tremendous amount of activity for the pawn. However, real fast, I do want to show you a couple of ideas from this position. Instead of rook c3, first of all, if white takes the knight, this is not a clean piece. Black simply goes bishop to f5. And now that knight on e4 is being pinned to the queen, and that means that knight is going to fall. Now, instead of queen takes c2 and instead of rook to c3, the best move for white is actually the tactical shot, knight takes d6. Now, real fast, the idea behind this move is that black takes the knight. Then after queen takes c2, bishop f5 is no longer possible as that square is no longer defended. So very cool tactical idea. There's other stuff going on there you can investigate on your own. Now back to the game. Rook to c3 is the move from Alireza. Now knight b4 defending the knight, and knight to g3 from white, getting the knight out of those attacks and setting up other knight ideas on the king side. However, Jan Nepomniachtchi is on his A game. He simply replies f5, gaining more space on the king side and trying to clamp down on white's idea of e4. However, in this game, Alireza Firouzja does not back down at all. Here he jumps forward e4 anyway, gaining more space in the center, and then after f takes, he recaptures with the bishop. Bishop takes e4. Now from here, black activates the queen on the h4 square. Very good idea. And white gains more space on the king side with the move f5. Very good idea. White may even be threatening the move f6 in the near future. Now here for black, the best move is going to be a rook to e5. The idea behind this move is you are putting pressure on that pawn on d5 as well as f5. Very good multi-purpose idea. However, instead, he misses the idea, instead going bishop d7, a very logical-looking move, putting pressure on a4 and pairing the b5 advance on the queen side. However, here, white finds a key idea. That is the move f6. Again, further blowing open the king side, actually threatening the move f7, forking the king and the rook on the e8 square. So here, queen takes f6 is virtually forced. White takes the queen, black takes back, white takes the pawn on the f6. And now, thanks to his inspired play, Alireza Firouzja finds himself with an advantage in the endgame. All right, from here, what should black do? Well, first of all, that pawn on the a4 square is hanging. Black should take it, actually. Bishop takes a4 is the right move here. However, instead, rook a to d8 is played by Jan, and now rook to h6 from white, putting pressure on that pawn on the h7 square. Now, rook to e7 defends, but then white picks up the pawn on the d6 square, and black still refuses to win that pawn on the a4 square because now the bishop is pinned to the rook. Now, rook to f8 from black, taking advantage of the open f-file, and rook takes c5 from white, winning another pawn. Black finally takes the pawn on the a5 square, rook to c4 from white, pressuring both the knight and the bishop on the a4 square. But here, Jan Nepomniachtchi finds a way to virtually force a draw in the endgame. He goes rook to g7, pressuring the knight on the g3 square. And here, white has a choice. The way to fight on is king to g2, defending. Instead, white takes the knight on the b4 square, rook takes b4, and then black manages to force a draw here. Rook takes g3, king h2, rook g7, and now white picks up that free bishop on the a4 square. White is up a piece, but here, the perpetual check, rook to f2, then f1, then back to f2. There's no way to block the check. Obviously, bishop to g2 loses the bishop. So for that reason, both players repeat moves and get a draw by repetition. All right, diving into game number 4, we have Alireza Firouzja versus Jan-Krzysztof Duda from the 2021 Tata Steel Tournament. Now, in the game, Alireza, of course, opens 1d4 and with the London system. And now, in this game, instead of the immediate bishop f4, here he does the other move order, knight f3, then after d5, finally bishop f4. And in previous games, we saw a different line starting with c5 or b6. Here, Jan-Krzysztof Duda is going to go for a completely different strategy, but a very important one to know how to counter. That is the one with e6 followed by bishop to d6. Now, the idea behind this move is very simple. Black is simply challenging that bishop on the f4 square, threatening bishop takes f4, and it's important to note that is not that scary of a threat yet. So here, white has a choice. He can deal with the threat of bishop takes f4 or simply ignore it and allow black to take on the f4 square. So, for example, various ideas here are possible. Bishop takes followed by c4 is very, very playable. Bishop g3 is quite good for white, and even knight to e5 is good for white. Instead of those options in the game, Alireza goes for the other idea, knight d2, just continuing development of the queen side. Now here in the game, black plays the best move. That is simply castling on the king side. If black does take on f4, then white, yes, he does have these double pawns on the f-file. However, these pawns are actually incredibly strong. And this is a very well-known pawn structure from 1d4 pawn openings. Here, white is going to have ideas like knight to e5, perhaps g3 bolstering the pawn structure, perhaps bishop d3 at some point, and maybe even h4 to h5 threatening h6, trying to get an attack going on the king side. So don't worry, if you get this kind of pawn structure in your own London system games, it's perfectly playable for white, nothing to worry about. But instead, short castles from black, and here, white had the choice. He could allow that pawn structure once again, going bishop d3, allowing bishop takes f4. But instead, in the game, white jumps in with the knight to the e5 square, knight to e5, stopping those bishop takes f4 ideas once and for all. Now, from here, black strikes on the queen side with the move c5. It's very, very difficult for black to delay this move forever. He simply needs to challenge white's pawn structure in the middle of the board. Now, white c3, bolstering the pawn center, again, that beautiful pawn triangle in the middle of the board. And here, black has a very big and very important choice to make. How is he going to get some counterplay going on the queen side? Well, there are a few different ideas, and of course, white's plan here is very, very simple. It's going to go knight to f3, and then pretty much start the attack with h4 and h5, getting space on the king side, and that's a very standard idea in the London system. We've seen it many times already from white in these games. However, black how is he going to stop that? If he just lets white attack on the king side without doing anything on the queen side, he's going to get blown off the board. Well, one of the main questions black has to ask is, do you want to keep attention in the center with this pawn on c5, or do you want to advance it to the c4 square or take on d4? Well, first of all, taking on d4 is not the best idea. Here, white is spoiled for choice. If he wants a good version of a Slav exchange structure, he can take c takes d4. And then, as you can see, white's bad bishop is outside the pawn chain, whereas black's bad bishop is stuck on c8, hitting his own pawn on e6. So for that reason here, white is going to have a very stable edge. However, beyond that, the other move, e takes d4, is also perfectly playable. Here, white's going to retain attacking chances on the king side. He can start the attack with h4 to h5. And as we saw in the first game, he also has the idea of expanding on the queen side with b4, a5, perhaps a5 or b5 next. Again, we saw that in that first game versus Gukesh. So overall, c takes d4, not a very good idea for black. However, the move c4 is very playable, and it's actually the top computer choice. The idea behind this is if black defends on the king side, eventually he can go b5, a5, and b4, gaining more space on the queen side, threatening to take, and from there he'll have the open b file, and that pawn on the c3 square will be weak for the rest of the game. So overall, c4 was the top computer choice here. However, in the game, queen c7 was played by black. Again, a very typical idea in these structures. Black often follows up with b6 and then bishop b7 or bishop to a6 in these lines. Now from here, white goes bishop d3, standard move, preparing short castles next, and black finally goes b6, showing his hand. Now, this move b6 kind of indicates black is not going to go c4 in the near future. If he did go c4, and then at some point followed up with the move b5, that would basically be a waste of a tempo going b6, then b5. So with that in mind, b6, black shows his hand. He probably wants to go bishop a6 and maintain the tension in the center for a while. Now here, Alireza expands on the king side with our favorite London system move, h4, bringing Harry, the h-pawn, into the game. And here, black has a choice. Do you want to go bishop b7 or bishop to a6? Well, here, bishop b7 is a little bit passive. White is just too fast with the attack. For example, a sample line is h5, immediately expanding on the king side. And then in many lines, white's even going to be able to advance with a very early g4. For example, if black blocks the king side here, that g4 immediately is a great idea, threatening g5. And while the computer does seem to think this is defendable for black in a practical game, that is a very difficult task. So going back, instead of bishop b7, here Jan-Krzysztof Duda plays the very important move, bishop to a6. Now, the idea behind this move is very simple. We saw it in that first Gukesh game as well. Black is trying to trade off his bad dark to light squared bishop, and once that problem piece is off the board, black's defensive task is going to be a little bit easier. Now here, there's no easy way to defend the bishop, so white takes on a6. Then knight takes, and now the knight on a6 is technically slightly misplaced. It'd much rather be on the c6 square. However, to achieve that, black's going to have to spend two tempos going knight b8, then knight c6. So overall, very good idea for white to trade on the a6 square. Now here, Alireza expands on the king side, h5. Once again, Prince Harry, the h-pawn, going down the board. And here, black's best bet is going to be stopping that pawn immediately in his tracks with the move h6. Of course, white is still very good here. His attacking plans include moves like queen to e2 and then possibly g4 next. However, instead, in the game, black goes knight to d7, and this is far weaker. I mean, no matter what white does, his attack now really starts to get some momentum. Now, from here, one idea for white is going to be taking on d7, then immediately following up with the move h6. However, in the game, Alireza Firouzja plays the more human-looking idea of knight d to f3, simply bolstering the knight on e5 and keeping that h5 or h6, idea in mind for later. Now here for black, taking on e5 really doesn't do a whole lot. White simply recaptures with the knight and not a whole lot changes. So with that in mind, instead of that, here black goes f6, trying to take control of the center and forcing white's hand with knight takes d7. So the good old-fashioned Ben Feigl counterattack with the move f6 coming in handy for black here. Now from here, the strongest idea for white once again is probably going to be knight takes d7, and then following up with the move h6, again try to trace some weaknesses on the king side. Instead, Alireza plays it more safe, and he responds to the move f6 with his own move knight to d3. Now here, black takes on the f4 square. White's obviously going to recapture with the knight, and he's going to have a great game. That pawn on e6 will be very, very weak. For example, bishop takes, then knight takes, and now black has to permanently defend that e6 pawn thanks to the Ben Feingold signature move f6. So instead of that, in the game, c takes d4 played from black. White recaptures with the knight, and then e5 from black. So we're starting to see the idea behind that Ben Feingold move f6. Black trying to gain space in the center, and if black does control the center here, that's going to stop white's attacking ideas on the king side with h6. Now, of course, the drawback of this move is the knight does have access to the e6 square, and here the knight does jump in immediately. And you may be wondering, did Duda miss this idea of knight to e6, or was this part of his plan all along? Well, based on how this game progresses, it's looking like Duda did actually intend for this to happen. Now black goes queen to c4, getting the queen out of the attack. Of course, the rook is going to fall, but here that bishop on f4 is still hanging. Now from here, white takes on f8. He's also threatening knight takes d7, so black is forced to take. He takes back with the bishop. Bishop takes f8. And now white, bishop g3. So here the dust is mostly settled. White is up an entire exchange. However, black does have very good compensation for it. I mean, first of all, his pawn center, he's completely dominating the middle of the board. And beyond that, the position is very closed. And that means these rooks aren't going to be as useful as the minor pieces, at least for the foreseeable future. So black giving up the exchange, but it does have decent compensation for it. Now black, knight d to c5, trying to activate the knights. And here, white's best idea, believe it or not, is going to be retreating the knight back to the c1 square. The idea behind this move is white does have the follow-up idea of rook to h4, threatening the queen, and white is actually going to be very, very good in this kind of position. Now, instead of knight c1, in the game here, Alireza Firouzja does take the knight on the c5 square. Knight takes c5 is the move. Black takes back with the knight. And now we do see that idea from white, rook to h4, activating the rook on the h-file, and immediately hitting the black queen on the c4 square. So this idea of rook h4 or rook to h3, again, a very common theme in the London system, especially in Alireza's games. Now here, black plays the key move e4. Instead of moving the queen, he simply blocks the center, and now the knight has access to the d3 square, and that knight is going to be an absolute monster there. Of course, that is a light square, meaning this dark square bishop is never, ever going to be able to challenge it. So again, we're seeing black's idea unfolding, giving up the exchange, but again, his minor pieces in this position are just incredibly strong. Now here, white develops the queen to e2, and this is also connected with the idea of a potential rook to d1 in the future, which white may need to do to challenge that knight on the d3 square, so stick around for that. Now here, black, knight d3, jumping in with the knight, king f1 from white, and then f5, further getting space on the king side and bolstering his pawn center in the middle of the board. Now here, Alireza Firouzja has to find a way to somehow break black's center, and he finds a very creative regrouping idea. You start king to g1, and you're about to see the idea behind this. It's not just getting the king away from the center. Here, black goes rook to c8, decent move, and then Alireza shows his idea, rook to h1. White actually wants to regroup with king to h2, and then bring this rook back along the back rank. Again, black's idea of e4 simply cuts white's rook on h4 out of the game. So now Alireza Firouzja is showing this very cool regrouping idea. Now black, king to f7, white, king h2, completing the idea. Bishop e7, developing the bishop. And now Alireza plays a last preparatory move, a3, a very important move. Of course, now rook a to d1 is possible without losing the pawn on the a2 square. From here, black expands on the queen side, b5, rook d1 from white, king to e6 from black. And here, white's best idea is going to be going rook d2, then rook hd1, and finally taking on the d3 square. However, unfortunately, Alireza in this position got a little bit greedy. He immediately took on d3 with the rook. The idea, of course, is after queen takes, e takes, he simply swings his rook over to the d1 square, rook d1, and if white wins that pawn, he's going to have excellent chances in this endgame. Of course, material is currently even, meaning if that pawn falls, white's going to have more pawns and the better pawn structure, and that is going to be potentially all she wrote. But here, black unleashes an absolutely brilliant idea. If you like tactical puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the right move for black here. And the only hint I'm going to give you is that this is a mind-melting move. It's going to blow your mind. All right, I hope you found it. The move for black, believe it or not, is bishop takes a3. Okay, what is the idea behind this move? First of all, obviously, if he does nothing, white's going to win the pawn and basically win the game. So bishop takes a3. Here's the idea. You win one pawn. White takes the bishop. You win pawn number 2. That's not it, though. You're going to win the pawn on the a3 square, and the pawn on the d3 square is now defended by the rook. So black's winning like 3 pawns here, defending the 4th. That is a big, big deal. So king g1 from white, trying to get the king back into the game. But then rook takes a3. And again, here, black, he has 3 pawns for the piece, also defending the d3 pawn that would have fallen otherwise. And here, black has excellent chances in the endgame thanks to his connected pass pawns on the queen side. His main plan is going to be pushing those pawns down the board. Now, from here, the endgame is very complicated. I'm going to go through it relatively quickly, as this isn't really that related to our topic of the Alireza Firouzja London system. But here again, black pushing those pawns down the board, white stopping it, trying to bring his pieces over to win that pawn on the b2 square. And that is what happens here in just a few more moves. White's going to eventually win it with the bishop. Of course, the bishop skewering the king and the pawn on b2. The king moves, then the bishop takes. Now, Alireza, his next plan has to be trying to get the bishop off the b2 square without losing the rook on b1. Of course, currently the bishop is pinned. If the bishop moves, that rook will fall. So with that in mind, white's going to start his idea, checking the king on e1. That means the bishop can now move, bishop to e5. And from here, white's going to try to slowly increase his activity on the king side. And believe it or not, in this position, black's king starts to get a little bit vulnerable. White spots this, brings his king over, and suddenly white has this little mating net around the black king. Of course, the king getting stuck on h5. Now the king moves, king to f5. Again, black can only go down to h4 with the king. This is not looking good for black. Here, bishop to f6, king takes, and this is a blunder because now rook to d1, and suddenly white is threatening rook to h1. That is going to be checkmate, and black here literally has nothing else he can do. For example, g4 is checkmate, and even rook takes g2 again. That's going to be rook h1 check, then rook h2, then finally rook takes is checkmate. So wow, very impressive game from Alireza. All right, diving into our 5th and final game, of course, it is Alireza Firouzja versus the GOAT, the king of chess, Magnus Carlsen himself. And this game took place in the 2024 Chess.com Classic in May. Now, diving into the game, of course, Alireza opens with d4, followed by bishop f4, the London system. And in this game, Magnus goes for something different. He does not go knight f6 early. Instead, he goes for immediate c5, c5 on the board. What is Magnus Carlsen's idea? Well, first he takes on d4, then he goes knight c6. So far, so good. Now here for Alireza, the standard move is, of course, knight to f3. I mean, what could be more logical than simply getting your knight out to the middle of the board? Well, instead of that, here Alireza goes for the move c3. This move is quite a bit slower, and it also gives up the option of going c4, breaking in the center at some point. I mean, yes, it's still possible, but here white would be wasting a tempo going c3, then c4. And this gives Magnus Carlsen just enough time to play an absolutely brilliant move that is going to blow your mind. In this position, the GOAT Magnus Carlsen plays Ben Feingold's signature move. That's right, f6, the Ben Feingold counterattack on the board. Now, Ben Feingold says never ever play f6, as if you do, your king is probably going to get checkmated in very quick order. Well, here, actually, black can play it, and it's very playable. The idea is after knight f3, black goes g5, expanding on the king side, and now the bishop is forced back to either e3 or g3. Of course, g5 was not absolutely required. Black can still go bishop f5 or bishop g4 in this position. However, Magnus does not miss the chance to show his flair and do something a little bit wacky wonky in this game. So g5 on the board. Now immediately on move 7, Alireza has a big decision to make. Where do you want to put that bishop? Well, here the best move is actually bishop to e3. If Alireza played this move, he would have a big advantage, especially after the follow-up move, after say anything from black. Then you immediately break on the queen side with the move c4. The idea behind this move is very simple. Here, black spent quite a bit of time on these extravagant moves f6 and g5. That means if white can blow open the center and play in the middle of the board, he's going to have a very good chance to get an edge in this game. Now, of course, instead of that, here Alireza goes for the move bishop to g3. This move is quite a bit more passive. It doesn't really synergize with the idea of c4 quite as well. And beyond that, on the g3 square, the bishop is at risk of being trapped by the h5, h4 Noah's Ark idea. And if the bishop was on the e3 square, from there it puts more pressure on black's kingside pawn. So just overall, bishop g3 is not as strong as a move here. Now in the game, Magnus goes bishop to f5, just continuing development. Of course, the move h5 may have been extremely strong in this position, threatening the move h4. So for example, after h5, here, white has to do something. The best move was probably h3, and then from there, black could continue just bishop f5 as in the game. So heading back to the game, bishop f5 on the board from Magnus Carlsen. Now here in this position, Alirez's big problem is how does he finish development? Well, the best move is simply bishop d3, offering the exchange of the bishops. So for example, if black takes on d3, white takes back with the queen, he follows up with short castles, and he's going to have an excellent game. But instead of that, in this position, he actually goes knight b to d2. Now, what's the problem with this move? Well, it's very simple. It blocks off the queen's communication with that d3 square, and that means bishop d3 is now impossible, as if white does that, black simply wins the bishop. Now, of course, there are other squares to develop the bishop to, particularly bishop e2 and bishop e5 are possibilities. However, neither of these squares are as good, and now that bishop on f5 remains very, very active for black. Now here, Magnus Carlsen simply expands on the king side, h5 on the board. Here, Alireza goes h3. Of course, the move h4 was quite a bit weaker here. Alireza correctly decides not to do that, as then after g4, black simply gets too much space on the king side. And if he goes knight to h2, really the only good move here, then e5 from black is very, very strong. And black's f6 idea is definitely paying off in this kind of position. So heading back to move 9, of course, Alireza goes h3, offer that h2 square for the bishop. If black ever goes h4, try to trap it. Now here, Magnus goes e6, a very flexible move, setting up ideas like bishop d6 or knight to e7, and Alireza goes bishop to b5. Now, this move may look good, however, it's not really the best idea. Here, black can simply go a6, giving the question to the bishop, do you really want to take on the c6 square? And believe it or not, if black does this a6, then the best move for white is simply retreating the bishop back to the e2 square. And here, instead of going to e2 directly in one move, black gets this extra move a6 in for free, and a6 is actually quite useful here. So heading back, instead of bishop b5, perhaps bishop b2 immediately was the right move from white. Now instead, bishop b5 on the board, and Magnus does not see or does not decide to do this a6 move. Instead, bishop d6 is the idea, simply challenging the bishop on the g3 square and setting up short castles. Now, not a bad idea, and here white has a wide variety of choices it could take on the d6 square. However, the problem with that is it does help black develop. For example, bishop takes d6, then queen takes d6, and black gets that extra tempo, queen takes d6, developing the queen, and that is definitely something white wants to avoid if at all possible. Now, in the game, he does go short castles, not a bad idea, and here Magnus Carlsen has the option of going bishop takes g3, try to double white's pawns on the king side. Now, the big question is this idea of bishop takes g3 a good idea for black, or does that actually help white in this position? Well, let's find out. Here, bishop takes g3 is actually not that good for black. Surprisingly, white's double pawns do stop black's advances on the king side quite well, and here white has these two open files for his rooks and his queen, and overall, white seems to have a pretty good position here. Now, instead of this, Magnus Carlsen sees that. He goes knight to e7, just continuing development and getting the knight to the best possible square on e7. Now, here in this position, the computer loves the idea of going h4 for white. It's kind of a strange-looking move, going to h3 and then h4 with the pawn. We're not going to worry about that one too much. It's kind of a weird computer move. Here in the game, Alireza goes knight to b3. The idea being, of course, now if black goes a6, white is going to have that retreat square d3 for the bishop. And surprisingly, that is what happens in the game. Here, Magnus goes a6, and white just drops that bishop back to the d3 square, where it is defended by the queen. And this definitely favors white. Now, black decides it is time to take on the g3 square. Bishop takes g3 from Magnus, then f takes g3, and then queen to d6, simply targeting that weak pawn on the g3 square. And now white has a big question. Do you defend the pawn with, say, queen to e1 or king to h2? Or do you simply ignore it? Well, in the game, Alireza correctly decides you actually don't have to defend that pawn on the g3 square. Instead, he simply continues developing with the move queen to e2, putting pressure on the e6 square in certain lines. Now, here's the proof in the pudding. If black takes on g3, then white has the very strong idea. Bishop takes f5. Now, no matter what black does, white is going to crash through on the e6 square with the queen. So, for example, knight takes f5 is a massive blunder. Then queen takes e6 is incredibly strong for white, putting pressure on the knight, on the pawn here, and white's going to have an excellent game. So instead, e takes f5 is the move, but then all the same queen to e6, and white is sitting pretty here. So all this to say, queen takes g3 in this position is definitely not the move. So with that in mind, what is black supposed to do here? Well, castling on the king side or even the queen side is very playable. But in the game, Magnus avoids both of those options. Instead, he takes the bishop on the d3 square. Bishop takes d3. White obviously takes back with the queen. The queen was being attacked. And here, Magnus Carlsen is quite concerned about his c5 square. With that in mind, he actually goes b6, trying to guard that square, preventing knight to c5 ideas. Now, this move b6 was not completely necessary. Here, instead, black could have simply gone long castles and had a great game. But instead, b6 on the board. Of course, the idea is if white ever goes knight to c5, and he has that knight locked in there, if he gets a rook on the e-file, then that pawn on the e6 square could be very, very vulnerable with both the knight and the rook attacking it. So with that in mind, b6 does make some sense. Now here, white goes knight to h2, the idea being he's trying to open up these files for the rooks. Perhaps he wants to go rook to a to e1 next, lighting up the rooks with these pawns. And beyond that, he's also getting out of the way of future g4 advances from black. Now here, Magnus Carlsen, he starts down a plan of trying to lock down the king side. He goes f5, and his follow-up move after rook a to e1, a very logical move from Alireza, is to go g4. His idea is he's trying to provoke the move h4 from white, which Alireza does play, and it is the best move. And now black has this permanently locked kingside structure here. Obviously, white's pawns are never going anywhere. He has no pawn breaks on the king side. And black is trying to argue that he benefits from this locked king side, but I'm not quite convinced that is the case. Of course, Magnus before had good attacking chances on the king side, but now there's not a whole lot that he can do. Now here, black goes king to d7. What is Magnus Carlsen's idea? Well, he's trying to find a safe haven for the king, but to be honest, here, short castles or perhaps king to f7 may have been a better idea. Now that this king side is completely locked down and white has no pawn breaks, the king is going to be very, very safe on the king side. But instead of that, king d7 on the board, and now Alireza goes for a very simple plan of doubling rooks on the e-file. He goes rook f2, and then after knight to g8, a rerouting move from black, he goes rook to e2. Of course, just lining up the rooks on the e-file with that weak pawn on the e6 square. Now, Magnus Carlsen's idea behind the move knight to g8 is he does want to reroute that knight to the f6 square. And now, before doing that, Magnus starts a rerouting move with the other knight, knight to d8. It's a very curious looking move, but it does have a very strong idea behind it. Here, Magnus simply bolstering that pawn on the e6 square, stopping any future rook takes e6 ideas from Alireza. Now here, what should Alireza be doing in this kind of position? Well, if you look at black's position, his king is kind of stuck on the weird d7 square. His knights and his rooks aren't particularly active. So here, look at all of white's pieces. His queen, his rooks lining up on the e-file. I mean, white is ready to strike. And with that in mind, here Alireza goes for the queenside pawn break c4, a very good move. The idea being, of course, white is better suited for an opening of the center than black. Now black takes on c4, white takes back, and Magnus finally brings his knight back to the very important f6 square. So a good reroute from e7 to g8, then back to the f6 square. Now, real fast, I do have to mention, instead of knight to f6, black does have the option of taking that free pawn on the g3 square. However, that is not a very good idea in this position, and here's why. After queen takes g3, white has an absolutely brilliant move. It is the exchange sacrifice. Rook takes e6. You give up the exchange, that being the rook for the minor piece. And the idea is that black takes the rook, then you jump in with the queen, and all of a sudden you have the rook, the queen, the knight, and even this d-pawn here that are all contributing to the attack, and black's king is in grave danger. Now, heading back to the game, knight to f6 on the board from Magnus Carlsen. Now here, Alireza Firouzja goes knight to f1. The idea being this is the only way to get the knight back into the game. His other pieces, his queen, his knights, and his rooks are all very active. So now his plan is to go knight to e3, trying to get that last piece in the middle of the board. Now here, Magnus Carlsen, rook to e8, a solid move, further supporting that pawn on e6. And now Alireza is concerned about this idea of rook to c8, putting pressure on the queen on the c4 square. So with that in mind, he does go queen d3. However, this move is a little bit slow and it wasn't totally necessary. Instead of that, knight to e3, just continuing to develop that knight, may have been a better idea. Now, queen d3 on the board. Here, black goes knight to c6. Good idea by Magnus Carlsen, putting more pressure on that weak pawn on the d4 square. And now other ideas like rook a to d8 are also possible if Magnus wants it. Now here, Alireza, he spots the idea of knight b4 from black. If black gets that in, then he's going to be forking both the queen and the pawn on the a2 square. So with that in mind, a3 is the move. Now, for example, if Magnus went knight to e3 here, perfectly playable. The only problem is if black does go knight b4, then the only good response to keep the queen and the pawn alive is queen b1, and that does look a little bit passive. So very understandable, this prophylactic move a3 from Alireza. Now here, Magnus Carlsen, he jumps in with the knight to the e4 square. A terrific move. From here, this knight's very active. It's impossible for white to really get rid of it. And that knight and the queen are putting pressure on that pawn on the g3 square. So very good stuff. Here, Alireza responds to the threat with his own move, king to h2. Now, this is a very double-edged move. On the one hand, this king does do a great job of defending the g3 pawn. However, on the other hand, at some point, black may want to go f4. And we see here, this queen is lined up with white's king. If this diagonal ever gets blown open, that could be very, very scary for white. Now here, after king h2, we are reaching quite a critical position in this game. Here, Magnus Carlsen has to find a way to complete development, get his other remaining rook into the game, and find a safe haven for his king. Now, from here, the best way to do that is perhaps king c7, intending a future king b7. At that point, the king will defend the a6 pawn. Of course, then white's queen cannot take it, and that means the rook on the a8 square will be free to enter the game on c8 or perhaps d8, depending on what the circumstances are. However, instead of that, in this position, Magnus plays, honestly, a little bit of a blunder. He goes knight to c5. I'm not trying to criticize Magnus here. He's obviously the greatest chess player of all time, but this move has a lot of problems. The obvious idea behind it from Magnus is that this d-pawn is pinned to the queen. If white goes d takes c5, black takes the queen on d3, and that's going to be game over. Now, instead of that, of course, Alireza plays the key move for white. That is knight takes c5. You capture with the knight, not the pawn. Now black takes on b5 or c5 with the b-pawn, and here Alireza Firouzja plays a very dangerous move, knight to e3. And I mean that in a good way for him. Here white is threatening all sorts of things with the knight c4 potentially, but especially this idea of knight takes f5. If white can get that knight sacrifice in under favorable circumstances and recapture with the queen, that is going to be so dangerous for black. So for example here, if Magnus Carlsen takes the pawn on d4 with the pawn, c takes d4, then we can see this knight sacrifice in action. Knight takes f5, then e takes and queen takes, giving the king a check. And now, shockingly, there is no good way to block the check. Obviously, queen e6 or rook e6 is not possible. But here's black's problem. If he goes king to d8, then obviously rook takes e8, wins the rook on the spot. But if he goes king to c7, then once again, rook takes e8. Then after rook takes, white regains a rook in return for his sacrificed knight. And he also has at least one pawn here. White is just completely winning in this position. So heading back to the big decision point on move 29, here obviously c takes d4 is not the idea. White responds knight takes f5. Here Magnus finds essentially the only good idea. That is knight takes d4. Now what makes this move so special, obviously he does win a pawn, but that knight also now guards the f5 square, stopping knight takes f5 ideas in their tracks. Now of course here Magnus Carlsen is up an entire pawn and white has double pawns on the g-file. Obviously, white has to get something going against the black king if he's going to prove his advantage in this position. Now here, Alireza Firouzja starts with the move knight to c4, putting pressure on black's queen on d6. Very good. Black moves the queen to the c7 square. Of course, there are other squares available for the queen. Queen e7, not a bad square either. Now, Alireza, how does he continue the attack against the black king? Well, immediately in this position, a few moves come to mind. First of all, knight to e5 looks logical. However, it kind of does stunt white's attack. After this move, the rooks no longer attack the e6 pawn, and it's not really obvious how white's going to follow up. So instead of that, one move, and the move Alireza plays in the game, is rook to e5. The idea here is you are putting pressure on that c5 pawn, and you may want to follow up with the move b4. If black ever takes on b4, then after c takes b4, that knight on the d4 square is actually hanging. So rook e5 from Alireza, a very good multi-purpose move. However, I do want to point out here, the immediate move b4 is not only playable, it may even be a significantly stronger option than the rook e5 as played in the game by Alireza. Now, the idea behind this move, of course, is that black takes the pawn, you win the knight, so that is not an option for black. Here, instead, if black goes something like rook a to d8, intending king c8 next, and the rook suddenly defends the knight, then here white can simply take on c5, and if black takes, then you can go rook e5 with again a tempo. So overall, this idea of b4 immediately looks quite strong for white in this position, and it's very thematic. When you have the attack, you want to open up lines of attack against the king. Now instead, rook e5 on the board, pressuring that c5 pawn. Good idea. Rook a d8 from Magnus Carlsen. And now here Alireza plays the move b4. So we got the move in, just not at the best possible moment to do it. Now black goes king e7, and here Alireza Firouzja, queen to e3. The idea behind this move, of course, is you are getting off that d file with the rook, and you are putting more pressure on the e6 pawn. Now real fast, in this position, it may look like white can actually win that pawn on the c5 square. However, that pawn is absolutely booby-trapped. Here, for example, if you go b takes c5, then the winning move for black is knight to f3 check, and beyond the check, the rook is hitting the queen. Ultimately, white is going to lose the queen. It's going to be a big disaster. Now, instead of that, if you go rook takes c5 in this position, here the winning move for black, believe it or not, is actually queen takes c5. You give up your queen for the rook, the idea being if white takes the queen, then once again, knight to f3 check, and the best move for white is queen takes f3, then g takes f3. And here again, black is up material. He has the exchange, the extra rook for the extra knight from white. So all this to say, heading back, queen e3, definitely the right idea from Alireza Firouzja, not falling for these various, X-ray attacks by the rook with the knight coming to the f3 square with check. Now here, finally, Magnus Carlsen does have the opportunity to take on b4 right away. C takes b4. And now he has a threat of queen takes c4, winning the knight. So what is Alireza supposed to do? Well, one option is rook c1, both defending the knight and setting up your own discovered attacks on the queen. But instead of that, here he immediately jumps into the g5 square with the queen. Queen g5 check is the idea. Now the king's got to go somewhere. King f8 is the move in the game from Magnus. And here, Alireza, he does not defend the knight on the c4 square. Shockingly, he plays the move a takes b4, and it turns out this is actually quite strong. Now, the idea, of course, is if black does take that knight on the c4 square, then white can force a perpetual check. The idea is after queen to f6, then wherever the king goes, you could just follow it with the queen, and there is no way for black to escape the checks. Ultimately, this will be a draw in the game. So instead of that, after a takes b4, black does not take the knight on the c4 square. Instead, queen to g7 is the move, offering the queen trade. But of course, Alireza declines. Queen to f4 is the move. Now after queen to f6, here, rook c5, threatening rook to c7. Very strong idea. Now, in this position, it's actually very difficult to find a good move for black. All of his pieces pretty much are on their best possible squares. Obviously, the knight being very centralized on d4, the queen being excellently placed, and the rooks on the d8 and the e8 squares are right where they should be. So, with that in mind, what is Magnus Carlsen supposed to do here? Well, his strongest idea is actually just waiting. He can go king g7 or perhaps king g8, just waiting until white shows his hand. Instead, in the game, he lashes out with the move knight to c2, trying to threaten the rook on the e1 square. However, this move is a fatal mistake, and here Alireza Firouzja has an unbelievable idea that nearly wins the game on the spot if he finds it. So if you like puzzles, go ahead and pause the video right now and try to find this move for white that nearly wins the game on the spot. It is absolutely beautiful. All right, the key move here for white is actually the rook sacrifice. Rook takes e6. And yes, this is a clean sacrifice of the rook. The idea is no matter what, you pretty much win the queen of black. Okay, here's the idea. Obviously, if black takes the rook with the rook, then rook takes f5, pins the queen to the king. That is effectively game over. Instead, if black takes the rook with the queen, then you have the idea rook takes f5 check. And now if the king goes to g7, you go rook g5 check, again hitting the king. Next, this pawn here is going to fall, and white's going to have a raging attack. Instead, as you go king to e7, then of course, rook e5, once again winning the queen. Now, finally, in this position, what if black goes queen g7, trying to retreat? Obviously, rook takes e8 is not going to win the game. Well, here, white has yet another way to win the game. Queen takes f5, and if the queen goes to f7, rook f6 wins the queen, and if king goes to g8, then rook to g6 wins the queen yet again. So no matter what black does, this idea of rook takes e6 is just devastating. Unfortunately for us, Alireza Firouzja does not find that in the game. Instead, our London system hero goes rook to b1, just trying to get the rook out of the attack of Magnus Carlsen's knight. Now here, Magnus jumps in with the rook to the d4 square. Not the best move per se, but very, very active, putting pressure on the queen. And now here, Alireza Firouzja goes knight to e5. This move looks insane. Of course, it does have the idea, if black takes the queen, then knight to d7 does win back the queen of black. And that is what happens in the game. Here, rook takes f4 is the move, then knight d7 check, king e7, knight takes f6, and then king takes f6. Now, obviously, white takes that hanging rook on the f4 square here, and g takes f4 is the move, then knight to e3 from Magnus Carlsen. And this move has a hidden idea. Black's actually threatening to go g3 check, and if the king takes back, then rook to g8 check, and suddenly both the knight and the rook are putting pressure on that pawn on the g2 square. If that pawn falls, black's going to have a tremendous amount of activity in this game. And that is actually what happens here. Here, rook e1 from Alireza Firouzja, then g3 check, king takes g3, and then rook to g8 from Magnus, again putting pressure on that pawn on g2. Now here, obviously, Alireza Firouzja does have a big decision to make. Where do you want to put the king? Well, it turns out there are two good squares, f2 and h2. However, in the game, he goes for the third option, king to f3, and this turns out to be a big mistake. So here's the problem. Obviously, you do not take the pawn with the rook, then the knight on e3 hangs, so knight takes g2 is the move. But then here, this knight is threatening the h4 pawn with check, and that is the big difference. If the king was on either f2 or the h2 square, then knight takes h4 would not come with check, and that would not cost white an additional tempo. But instead here, that extra tempo is just what Magnus Carlsen needs in this game. Here, Alireza rook to h1, then rook g4 from Magnus. Of course, Magnus attacking both the pawn on f4 and the pawn on h4. Now here, Alireza tries to get some counterplay with the move rook to c6, but black takes the pawn with check, that being the big difference as we talked about. Now king e2, rook takes f4, and finally in this position, both sides go for a repetition of moves. We have black giving the king these checks. Alireza Firouzja just responds by shuffling his king, and in the end, both sides agreed to a draw in a completely level position. Wow, what a game by Magnus Carlsen, and of course our hero in this video, Alireza Firouzja. Alright, Chess YouTube, that is it for today. I hope you enjoyed this London system video. If you did, do me some favors here. Go ahead and like the video, subscribe, and let me know in the comment section what you liked about this video. I'm planning on doing a lot more of these opening style videos in the future. And as always, I will see you in the next video.